Now I want to hear some of your stories. What is the coolest thing you've done with the player character's backstory in a campaign? And Fred, I want you to start.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest about this because me and AJ were discussing that last question before we came here, and it's the one question I disliked the most out of all the questions you gave us. It is the one question that just and I will explain why I don't like it. I'm not going to explain why AJ doesn't like it. I'm going to explain why I don't like it.
I've actually
The
changed my mind. I
problem
like this
is,
question.
the problem is for this question with me is that I'm not a fan of building a campaign around a character's backstory. And that's not because I haven't done it. I've actually done that many, many, many times. Okay. But the problem is when you start doing that sort of thing is if you have 5 or 6 players at your table, getting them to all come to the table with a backstory that you can then tie all their backstories together into a campaign is actually pretty hard to do well. And I've had limited success, and it's been all right success and then really good success. So again, I find it frustrating when I hear, and I know it's like the new modern thing, tie the character's backstory into the campaign, but I feel like that's back to front. For me, I go the other way. I prefer players to build a character's backstory around my campaign. I have a discussion about what the campaign will be, but then I want all the players, look, I'll give you enough information and you can build a backstory around the campaign rather than the other way around, because you just make life miserable for yourself. I've been there before. I don't like doing that sort of thing. So what I thought I would do, and since I don't really have like a cool story with regard to this, instead I'm going to tell you a story and you'll let me know if it's complete shite or whether it sort of was where you were wanting to go. Okay, that's where I'm going to go with this
Yeah,
play.
let's do it.
Okay, so we're playing Dungeons and Dragons 4E. Okay, everybody just unsubscribed and stop watching the video.
Yeah.
but
I like
basically,
4th edition.
yeah, I liked it at the early stages. It was later on that I had enough. At higher level, it's hard.
That's
hard.
another video.
Yeah, that's another video. Okay, so basically, my brother Sam, was playing a shaman shifter called Sam Hain. Okay, and all I had was this. My brother had given me is that he had a shaman who could speak with spirits and call spirits to him, and he was linked to them in some way. And he was a shifter. He was basically a werewolf who could transform back into a human to a certain degree, but really he was basically like mostly werewolf looking all the time because there was shifters in 4E and you could have different type of shifters. And so I ran a campaign called Howl at the Moon, which was all about werewolves. And what was happening was that the werewolf lord had been killed, had been replaced by somebody who had basically trying to arrange a war between the werewolf clan or nation and the high elves. And as a result of that, things were getting out of hand and the party got involved and his character got involved. And ultimately what had happened is their leadership was the wrong leadership for the clan, for their nation. So Sam Hain stepped in, and with the assistance of the party, and this didn't play out till much later on, it took a little while to do this, the party helped him defeat the werewolf leader, the evil werewolf leader, okay? So in the story, not all werewolves like evil, just for those of you who are trying to get their head around that.
Hashtag not all werewolves.
That's right, okay. Something like that. And then basically he brought a truce between the high elf nation and the werewolf nation. And the only way he could do that successfully was he had to have his character take over leadership of the werewolf nation. And to do that, he had to say goodbye to his character, because that would be the end of his arc with the party. The party wouldn't stay with him. They would move on, and he would stay as the leader of the werewolf nation. And he sat there, and it was really hard for him to do. And he was really sad. I think he might have even cried. Yeah, I just put that on video, Sam. So if you're watching this video, which I know you're probably not, yeah, I just told everybody you cried in a Dungeons and Dragons.
Bigger respect for your dedication and emotional commitment to the game, Sam.
But here's the thing. I respect that. Here's the thing for him when he had done that and had it all played out, and it was really tough because they were very close to being unsuccessful, and it did take the whole party for him to actually fulfill that role. He came back and he said, Fred, I really liked Sam Hain and I missed that character so much, and I wanted to keep playing that character. And to have my character no longer part of the party is a huge blow to me. But I can't think of a single thing that you could have done that could have made the experience of playing that character better than having him take over responsibility for an entire nation and bringing a truce between two warring nations. And I have to thank you for that. He said, I'm still sad and, a little angry, but I'm also really pleased you did it. And I said, yeah, well, look, dude, you didn't have to make that choice. You could have left those nations warring and walked away. And he said, yeah, I know I could have, but I'm not. And that's the best story I have for you.
That's a great story. I think that it felt so fulfilling in a way because that character arc was getting into the right spot because of how the story transpired. I think that if he had found a way to play that character with the group a little longer, it just wouldn't feel the same. I see why in that situation you need to take on that role, become that essentially an NPC in that world, and fulfill your arc and move on.
Totally.
Yeah. Zion, do you have a cool story with a character backstory?
Yeah. I love this question just because I'm a contrarian, but also because I just like talking about D&D. Yeah, I love it when my characters bring backstory to the table. I do think that, Fred, you made a really good point. Having your players bring backstories that are appropriate to the campaign is huge. Like, if we're just doing a big sandbox thing, it's like, whatever. If I just say, hey, we're playing a sandbox campaign, who knows what's going to happen, bring whatever backstory you want. If it comes up, great. If it doesn't, whatever. It's a sandbox campaign. If we're doing a campaign that is a very deliberate point, like, hey, we're doing this is the adventure, and a player wants to bring a backstory that can factor into that, then I will always try to find a way to make it work. But it's also done with the understanding that hey, if this doesn't come up, them's the breaks. But I do love it when players put in the effort to make really interesting backstories. And I think the most fun I had with a character backstory, at least in recent memory, was also in that Tall Tales campaign that we did, actually, which I mentioned earlier. Just a quick little rundown. That campaign was basically, it was greatly inspired by Redwall. So all the characters were woodland creatures. It took place in the world of Sylvain, which was a campaign setting that I created specifically for this game, where everything was just compressed. So you had on the bigger end, you had badgers and stuff, and foxes, and on the smaller end, you had moths and insects and stuff that were all squished down to that medium threshold. So it was just whatever. We're not here for realism. We're here for a good time, not a long time. Yeah. So whatever. Yeah. That was what we did. One of the party members who was kind of what kicked off the adventure was another one about warring kingdoms. Actually, to the west, we had the Empire of Locke, which was all the fish people in the big lake. And they were a shattered empire that were starting to the Duchess of Locke had basically started building everything back up, and she was on the war path, because there was like a war that had happened a dozen years ago or so. In the eastern side, we had the nation of Corum, which was where the rats live, and the Rat King, who was a literal rat king. It was a governing body of 12 officials who were all bound magically at the tail together. And they presented themselves as a singular entity, but they existed behind this veil and spoke with a dozen unison voices. It was very creepy. So the Rat Kingdom was very like 1984. They detested magic because that was a means for people to rise up. You know, they were very controlling, very like secret police, all that kind of stuff going on. There was a war brewing between them and this other big empire. So the party was rallied around Erin's character, who's one of the people who plays on our live play show, and her character was the adopted princess of the insect kingdom, which was smack dab in the middle. And it was in their interest to preserve peace, because whichever side they ended up having to side with, their country was the one that was going to get ravaged because they were between these huge like superpowers. And the kingdom of the insects, of course, were ruled by the monarchs, as in the monarch butterflies. And Erin rolled up a character who was an adopted princess. She was a moth. And her backstory was that the reason she was adopted into the royal family was because her family was a very magically potent one. They were very powerful and like knew a lot about practicing magic. And through basically what happened was the Rat Kingdom, who is very fearful of magic, they sent inquisitors to the moth noble homestead, whatever, and they burned it to the ground. So almost their entire magical claim was like genocided, basically. So she was the last of her kind. She survived as a baby. She was adopted by the royal family. That was her backstory. Great. So what I did with that is I was like, what can we do with the political ramifications of this? That was why she was selected to be the agent of peace that the insects sent, because the whole idea was the king was saying to her, if you can forgive them and try to broker peace, maybe they can forgive the lock, and like you can use that to kind of like pull on some heartstrings, you know, and be like, hey, your people have wronged mine in the past. I'm here trying to extend an olive branch and like fix this horrible mess. What I did with that backstory was I took that and I was like, great, that's what the players think happened. That's what she thinks happened. What actually happened is that they burned themselves because they were developing this world's equivalent of a nuclear weapon in the previous war, and they were doing so at the behest of the reptile, the Snake King, the Long King in the north. And they were doing this on behalf of him. And they, through just by messing it up, basically, they blew themselves up. The rats were present because they were investigating them, but they had no intention of doing any of this. And they were blamed for it because their agents were seen like around that area. But the rats allowed themselves to be blamed for it because in the aftermath, they were able to steal the magical secret to making this giant, powerful weapon. And they would rather have the world think that they burned this place to the ground than have the world know they're innocent and they did it to themselves, and that there was this magical secret to like this nuclear weapon basically that existed. So it was more beneficial to them to come off as the bad guys than to let the rest of the world know this happened. So of course, through political discourse and intrigue and all this stuff, the party found out about this, which then presented them with a huge moral dilemma. It was like, okay, well, now it's in like the reptile kingdom, the Snake King, like he knew that this existed, and he was the only other part of the world that knew this existed. So he was sending infiltrators to try to like steal it from the rats, and they didn't want to tell anyone about it. So there was this whole thing going on where basically her entire worldview was shaken up because her whole life she had been told that the rats are just the bad guys. And like, they're pretty bad because they do all this like suppression of knowledge and all this stuff. But ultimately they were like the thing standing between the world and potentially nuclear annihilation at the hands of the reptile kingdom. So it took an element of the backstory and was like, yeah, that's kind of true, but actually what happened. And like, as that revelation unfolded, it just threw a big wrench in what the players were expecting to take place. And it was awesome. It was super fun, and I'm very happy that all of that is documented because it was a wild campaign.
That's a great premise. It kind of reminds me of the Watchmen movie. How like the good guy takes the fall, because it's like, well, I'm not really attached to the world anyway, so let them think I'm the bad guy if it broke his peace. And then
Exactly.
the one guy who you think is the most psychotic member of the group is actually the moral backbone, and his journal could unravel everything. It's just like that was beautiful.
Yeah, and
real good writing.
It spirals out too when you do stuff like that, because going back to the point I mentioned earlier where you had a character death, the character who died in that game was played by my friend Eric, and he was a disgraced noble. Like, he was a drunken master rat from the kingdom that the party happened upon. And his meeting up with the party, I mean, it was obviously planned, but from the story perspective, it was purely coincidental that he just ended up with them. So his character was meant to kind of be their introduction to like the underbelly of the like rat kingdom and like what it's really like beneath the surface. But then in the first attack from the lock, he died. He was a mage slayer because he had originally trained to kill mages, and that was why he left his family, because he didn't want to do that anymore. And then there was a wizard who was casting spells, so he ran up, took them down, and the rest of the guard stabbed him to death. The party was like, oh, this sucks. Maxim, that was his name, is dead. And it kind of threw a wrench in my plans, because part of his backstory was all this stuff with like his noble family and his older brother trying to like take power, and how he had like faked the death of his older sister so that he would be next in line, and all this other stuff. So I was like, crap, I don't have a way to introduce that. And I was like, okay, let's stop and think for a second. What can his older brother do now that he's dead? So what he did was he martyred Maxim. He basically went out and was like, my younger brother and I were best buds. I loved him so much. And he died at the hands of the lock because he was trying to instigate war. So he was like, we need to rise up. And he like had the church saint him posthumously and was like, we need to fight back for Saint Maxim the Burned, is what they called him. And the party was just like, oh no. And I watched Eric's face when he was giving this monologue at his funeral. And I watched Eric's face, who was now playing his new character, just like, he was so upset because he was like, this guy sucks. Like, I know so much about him, but he couldn't say anything from a roleplay perspective. So yeah, I don't know. Backstories are fun, but that obviously wasn't something that I was planning to do, but it ended up getting incorporated just because the circumstances fell.
And one thing that I really like to do with backstories is encourage the players to leave loose ends and things that we can pull on during the campaign to kind of, you know, fill in situations like you've mentioned. And but this is elaborate in the best possible way. This is like sounds like an incredible political campaign.
It was a pretty wild political campaign, and like, I don't know, the best part about that game was all the animal puns. Because we had we had a bee kingdom, and they were all Vikings, and they were berserkers. It was
I just like the idea that the reptiles are against the rats. It's like, yeah, it's our food.
Yeah, well, exactly. And there was that like element of like food chainery, because something that we had introduced to the campaign as well is there weren't really like gods. There was like a church that worshipped like the good god, basically, which is basically like, yeah, this is like the one church institution, whatever. But we had this concept of there being like primals, which were the bigger animals, so like bears and deers and like alligators and stuff. And we had ruled that because they were so big, like they didn't have the same level of like sentience, like they were operating on a different level than all the smaller animals were. But there were like shrines where you could go and feed them or bring them gifts or whatever, and like the bees would bring all the bear like a bunch of honey, and if the primal bear came out and ate that, it might like bestow a blessing on them or something like that. So we had a character, Eric's new character, who was another moth, was a paladin who fell into disgrace because in order to help win the last war, him and his paladin order made a sacrifice to the aspect of the alligator, which was like the one evil one. So like him and his like other 7 knights all went there and drew straws, and he drew the longest one. So they paid the price, which was sacrificing the rest of the order to imbue him with power. So that was where all his like magic power as a paladin came from, because before that they were just like warriors basically. And then after the war, the king was like, cool, thanks for doing that, but you're banished now, so bye. Because, you know, having that kind of person around after an age of war doesn't really sell magazines, as they say. So anyways, yeah, it was a really fun campaign. It was a really fun world, and there was a lot of stupid puns.
That's awesome. So AJ, back to you.
Right. Okay. Hang on to your hats, everybody. This is going to get crazy. Okay. So I had a ostensibly on the surface, it was a Rod of Seven Parts campaign. Rod of Seven Parts campaign is, I find, one of the trickier ones to if you're trying to stick to the original source material, trying to bring it to a modern game, particularly my play style, which is very sandboxy and a lot of player agency. Because there's certain steps in that campaign where you really have to talk to this NPC, or you like, why is this dog here? And the players are expected to, understand why this dog's important. They paid no attention to that whatsoever. They were very much focused on their own character story and stuff, because of the crazy amount of leeway I gave them with the character creation and the secrets that were built into these characters. The secrets of those characters ended up being the main focus and driving force of this campaign. The Rod of Seven Parts was just the veneer over top of what was going on with these characters that the players were not telling each other. So this was a campaign where it was, the tension was at any moment your character could be revealed and everything falls apart. Absolutely everything. Also, with the strangest character, it turns out that the player didn't even know what was going on with their own character, and they were enjoying the unveiling of, oh, what's my actual nature? What's going on? So anyway, here's the player characters. We got my friend Ian, who is playing a green slard, who is transformed into the guise of a dragonborn barbarian. And instead of doing primal shouts, he's doing these croaks, which are releasing chaos. His entire focus of his character is to spread chaos. So he does things like, oh, remember that cursed magical jar of cookies? I'm going to scatter them around this town and see what happens. A riot ensued, a riot that actually ended up killing the most normal member of the party, who went off by himself and got killed by an undead thing, which took an opportunity to come from a graveyard and just nab him, like in the middle of the city. And he was just like, that was unfortunate. I'm just like, never split the party,
Fair enough.
But because every time this green slard got anywhere near somebody with true sight, or like a goggle of true seeing or anything like that, he was like super tense. He's like sending me private messages like, how do I get out of this thing? He ended up killing an NPC with like a big chaotic fireball released, and disguised it perfectly well from the other players of the game as like one of his barbarian shouts or something. Or I don't know where that came from. It's like, half the town is burnt down. This NPC is dead. And it's all because of the action of you. He actually summoned, he lured a dragon to a township that they just arrived at, and it caused mass devastation while they're all in a tavern having a fight with some NPCs. And outside, it's like, they open the door and like, what happened? It's like, he happened. I couldn't tell him anything because it's just like, well, this is what ensues. And he's sitting there trying not to break the secret. That was just one of the secrets, and that never actually got unveiled the entire time until the very end of the campaign. They actually died from a TPK from busting in on some, they had to kill a bunch of dragons, one after the other, in order to unlock a tomb that had one of the parts of because I was ad-libbing like crazy towards the end of this campaign. Cloud castles, killing a bunch of dragons to unlock a giant. Like, the giants had buried this part of the Rod of Seven Parts deep, because the dragons, the giants were basically primal. They like chaos as well. Yeah. And the Rod of Seven Parts is very much about order, and it imposes order on whoever carries it and wherever it goes. So the more parts you put together of this thing, the more orderly it becomes. It actually changes the nature of your character. And that was the key to the other character. Andrew was playing get this. Imagine the Drow are raiding a Sahuagin colony, and they kill off all the Sahuagin apart from one of the clerics, who's very, very, very dedicated and pious towards the goddess Blibdulpoop. Blibdulpoop is an aquatic goddess who incorporates madness in her portfolio. That's very much on brand for the Sahuagin, who invent gods that actually manifest and become real. And Blibdulpoop became a major focus of this character and campaign. And it developed, I didn't actually plan this, and he didn't plan this either. It just developed as part of the chaotic nature of this character. In order to resurrect this this dead cleric, Blibdulpul, went, well, instead of like making a new body, that's too much effort, I'm just going to use one of the burnt and dead drow that was raiding the colony and put that character's soul in there and resurrect it as a reincarnation. So we've got this burnt and disfigured drow who has the ability to breathe underwater and is in league and in tune with Blibdulpul, way more than you would think. The character had an excessively high wisdom score, which I crafted into the game, which meant that all the rest of the party turned to the character as a leadership position, because every time something was coming up, I was telling that character first, because your character can see it before everybody else can. Something which DMs really need to pay attention to. Like, if your character's got a very high wisdom score, other people are going to listen to what they say because they see it first. They're the font of information. Anyway.
True.
It was difficult for the other players because his character was so weird and so just disconnected from things. And it's just like, what is this? Well, I'm a drow, but I've actually got the soul of a Sahuagin. It's like, what? And this progressed to the end of the campaign. And here's the thing: the other player in the campaign was just like an ordinary human. Didn't have any big secrets or anything. It's just like the fall guy who was like, what is going on? This campaign is crazy, but he loved it because he's a consummate role player, so he can play anything perfectly. Anyway, so we've got two characters who are essentially dedicated to chaos, who are going after the Rod of Seven Parts with the intention of it never being assembled. But the Sahuagin, who is now a drow, who is now a servant of Blibdulpul, actually turned out to be an aspect of Blibdulpul who has gone too crazy and was using the Rod of Seven Parts to impose law and become just lucid enough to return to godhood status and re-emerge. Yeah. Oh, it was mad. So the campaign was never going to reassemble the Rod of Seven Parts. It's crazy if you even try to do that. It's just like an impossible sort of task anyway. That's kind of the point. It's like this endless quest of trying to get this thing back together. If you reassemble it wrong, the parts disappear and vanish to different planes of existence. It's a nightmare of a campaign for a player, but some people really love that. It's like, let's try and do this impossible thing. But in this case, they were actually two of the party were working against that, and the other person was just like, had no idea. So yeah, we're at the final end where there was a TPK. They're all kind of disappointed, just like, oh man, we just got absolutely trounced by this, because they did no preparation before. They thought they were walking into a dragon lair. Turns out they were walking into a mind flayer hive with an elder brain and a bunch of big yeah, they just got minced. And it was one of the worst TPKs ever. But the idea that now they were the mind flayers were so amused by what these characters actually were, so they just said, "We're not going to consume your brains. We're just going to wipe your memories and let your true natures take over." So the end scene of the campaign was the Slad chasing after these terrified drow and somebody else, off into the distance. It's just like you turn back into a monster. The Slard's like, I'm going to breed you, and I was yeah, that's it. Yeah.
Oh wow.
It was such a memorable campaign because those characters were so weird, and it was just like I was dealing with all of this subplot stuff that was going on, and the tension was just the unveiling of these secrets built tension into the game automatically.
They weren't revealed until after the TPK.
Until everybody died. Yeah.
Oh wow.
And then Alex, who was the only normal character, he's like, what was your character was a slut? Yeah, it was great.
Wow.
I miss the days of monstrous player characters with like effective levels and stuff.
Green Slard make perfect Doctor Who characters. They're the perfect Time Lords when you think about it. Like,
that's true.
One
of the biggest mistakes I made of my early career was allowing a player to be a sentient giant squid. But that's a story for another time.
Yeah. We will hear that story at some other time.
That story will also be told.
So I had quite a few things that I did with character backstories, but one of the memorable ones was with a fire sorceress that's played by one of the players in a long-running campaign that it's like already almost 5 years in the run. But that character in the backstory was captured by a wizard in the academy. She went to the academy because she thought they would be able to teach her how to control her powers, but it was more of a wizard's academy. And they were like, yeah, you can stay here and try stuff, but we don't know what to do with you. But that wizard, that guy, he had other thoughts in mind. He had a project where he searched for sorcerers and essentially turned them into magic items that he can use to harness their powers because he was jealous of their gift. So there was a period in her backstory where this guy captured her, put her in a cage, kind of messed with her mind to see how her powers worked as he was researching everything he needs to learn to create that item. And then he was stopped. He was forced to run away. But then later in the campaign, when the characters came back to this mage tower, to this mage academy, essentially, they've arrived to the same place that she was locked in, and they have repurposed the place to something else because that wizard is gone. He is a black stain in our books. We don't want anything to do with him. But that same place in the ethereal plane, I play with spirits a lot in my game. So the ethereal plane was imprinted by her terrible experience, and it actually conjured a spirit, a dark spirit that fed on her frustration and despair at that moment.
Like a living haunting.
Yeah, like a living haunting.
Cool.
And that roamed the tower and kind of did a lot of crazy things while they were in the tower. And the final showdown was there in the ethereal plane where they jumped in and saw that cage and the room as it was before, and had to fight off essentially that spirit that was created from her nightmarish experience. So that was something that I'm really proud of, and they haven't yet found that wizard. They will eventually find him and his other experiments. But
So if you're watching this and playing the campaign, you've done a terrible thing.
yeah. But yeah, to be continued.
I love that idea of a living person being the cause of like some sort of supernatural thing. What was that movie, Night Watch? There was a lady who'd done something so horrible that she caused a nexus of evil around her. Or there's various ways you can play that.
Yeah, so I love that concept, and everything in my world has it. I'm a big fan of that idea of memories and emotions have their own magic, and they can conjure creatures and phenomena around people. So I really like that idea.
You should check out Theros.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of obsessed with Theros right now.
I just might.
Yeah, that's a big concept in Theros.
We just make like 10 videos on it, and I'll watch.
Yeah, I will. I intend to.
I love the idea of the ethereal plane having echoes of the memory of the prime material plane. So if you're a character who's a specialist in the border ethereal plane, you can actually investigate like what was here when the dungeon was first built. Like this is a ruin now, but I can actually go to the ethereal plane and find the memory of what this place once was. So it's like superimposed as this ghostly castle over top of this ruin, and it might have ghosts and stuff who are still living there.
Exactly. So I've actually self-promotion corner. The last supplement I published was all about supernatural phenomena, and one of them is called the Memento Etherealis, which is exactly that, a location that is the ethereal plane sort of remembers it differently. So you can have a forest that has overgrown, but many years ago there was a battlefield there. And when you walk in that forest, sometimes you can smell a faint like smell of blood or smoke, and maybe see a flash of something moving around. But if you go into the ethereal plane or look into it, you can see everything still, the piles of corpses and the ghosts fighting each other and everything. All the chaos is still going on, but almost no trace of it in the ethereal plane.
It sort of begs the question: if a soul passes on to the outer planes and they forget who they once were, because it's kind of a burden that draws them back to the prime material plane, and really the idea of the outer planes is their core self, their soul is their, I don't know, the kernel of their personality, and like it gives them that freedom to explore the maximum potential of what they could be. But where do those memories go? Are they retained by the ethereal plane? So some aspect of their memories is left behind, an echo. So everybody's got a ghost, or does it go onto the Feywild and become part of their legend? So they're like, it's compartmentalized. Nothing's really lost. It's the mental aspect of their character is still retained in the outer planes, or the border planes on the prime material plane. It's like, juicy stuff for stories.
And that's it for this video. Thank you everyone for joining us and for this lovely chat. Again, let's go around and everyone tell us where we can find you and on the internets. So Fred, tell us where we can find you.
Well, you can find me on YouTube, Twitter, and Facebook under How to D&D. You probably might find me under Frederick Wheeler on Twitter. I don't know how it sort of lists me, but yeah, those are the places.
Awesome. Josiah, back to you.
Yeah, if you search Dungeon Dad on YouTube, you'll find me. I'm also on Twitter, Facebook, Reddit.
Awesome. And AJ, where can we find you again?
Yep, you can find me on YouTube. Just type in AJ Pickett and you'll find all of my content. You can also find me on Facebook if anybody still uses it. I admin a bunch of groups that are all started with Sages of, and then the specific world setting. So Sages of Forgotten Realms is one of our biggest ones. We do Eberron, Birthright, all sorts of different stuff, and they're really good communities that focus on the lore of the game. So if you want to learn about it without all the politics and that sort of stuff, we basically stick to the scholarship.
Oh, a lot of good things in there. So thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, remember that you are awesome, keep being awesome, and we'll see you beyond the screen. Bye.